So trying something a little different here. This is my drum YouTube channel where I mainly post covers of me playing music I like on drums. But some of you who are familiar with me, you may know that years ago I co-hosted a Jethro Tull podcast named Vernacular Verbose. And it's been a long time since that ended, and a lot's happened since then. I'm still in Tokyo, as you can see behind me. I'm in Yoyogi Park here in Tokyo. I've been traveling a lot. I've been working a lot. I joined a new band a couple of years ago that I'm very happy with. We got the opportunity to tour in Europe last year, which was really awesome. And actually, just this week, I moved into a new apartment. So been busy, lots of stuff happening. But kind of in all that time, I have kind of missed talking about music in kind of a critical way. So I've been thinking about doing more of these kinds of videos where I'm just talking to the camera about music or drums or whatever. And something happened recently that kind of gave me a good excuse to do one of these videos. And that's that the Jethro Tull Unwrapped edition reissue box set came out. Now, anybody who may have been familiar with the podcast, you may know that I love this album. I've always loved this album. I'm a genuine fan of this album. I actually did a video several years ago where I played through the entire album from front to back on live drums. And even though this album has been kind of, you know, infamous in the Tull community as being the black sheep of the discography, the one that everyone hates, I've always been a very steadfast supporter of it. So I was floored when this got announced. I could not believe that they were really reissuing this. I thought it was never going to happen. It had been several years since the last remix when Broadsword came out, and so I was just like, okay, this isn't coming out. They're not going to do it. But then, lo and behold, only I think a month ago from now, they announced it to be released the very next month. So I think the big headline here is that there's a mix with brand new drum sounds, and I think there's been a lot of anticipation with this album of if they're going to remix it, how are they going to handle the drums? And so we got our answer that they didn't use a human drummer, which a lot of people were anticipating. And instead, they basically are using MIDI samples to replace the drum machine parts to sound kind of more organic and more acoustic. And not just that, but we also got two mixes of the album. So they gave us the new drum mix, but they also gave us the original drums completely remixed separately. And then on top of that, we also got Walk Into Light, the Ian Anderson solo album from 1983, which has always been kind of considered a sister album to Under Wraps. So there's a ton of material here. And I'm not going to cover Walk Into Light at all in this video. I honestly haven't even listened to it yet. I've just spent the last week just listening to Under Wraps as many times as I can on as many different kind of sets of audio hardware as I can to check it out. But I do want to get into Walk Into Light eventually and kind of go through that as well. One last thing that kind of surprised me when this got announced is that they are reverting to the vinyl track listing. So anyone who may be familiar, Under Wraps, as far as I know, was the first Tull album that was released with a vinyl track listing and a CD track listing that was totally separate. So the CD track listing has an extra 4 tracks on it. And I always just kind of assumed that the CD track listing was the intended track listing of the album, and that the only reason that the vinyl track listing was shorter was just because of capacity and space constraints. But kind of, I was surprised to see on the track list that they went right back to the vinyl track listing, and instead the bonus tracks are put at the end of the album and they're categorized as associated recordings. I was hoping in the booklet that they would have talked about that a bit more, that they would have kind of talked through the thought process of those extra tracks on the CD, and they would have kind of clarified which version of the album was kind of intended, but they didn't really touch on it. There's just one little anecdote in there about, like additional capacity on the CD led to an extra 4 tracks. So nothing really in there to clarify that much, but it seems like from the track listing that the shortened vinyl track listing is the intended album, which kind of surprised me. So, there's a lot of ways that you can listen to this album now. You can really kind of customize your listening experience, which is really interesting. A lot more than any other Tull album that's been put out. So when I got this, I was kind of sitting there staring at my media player thinking, how am I going to listen to this for my first listen? How do I want my experience of this to be the first time around? And what I ended up going with was I decided to listen to the original drum mix first, for the reason that I thought that listening to the new drums on first listen would be a little too much at one time, having to take in the remix album, but also the new drums at the same time. So I decided I would do the original drum mix first and then kind of hear what they did with the new drums later. And then I had to decide, well, which track listing do I want to listen to this in? Do I want to listen to it in the vinyl track listing? Do I want to listen to it back in the CD track listing? Do I want to put the bonus tracks at the end? And I decided to put it back in the CD track listing because that was kind of what I'm used to. So I think my immediate impression on first listen to this is that it's one of the most impactful remixes that we've ever had for the Tull album. The previous Tull remixes, they really kind of approached it with the philosophy of hewing closely to the original recordings as much as they could. And when they would go in and they would recreate effects and things like that, but generally they would really try to do it in a style that really matched the original album as much as they could. That is philosophy is totally out the window on Under Wraps here. They really came at this from kind of the ground up, really redoing it in a very kind of drastic way that sounds very different from the original mix. And I wonder if they did that because, I mean, this is Under Wraps, which has a reputation as being the one that most of the fan base hated for a long time. So they kind of felt an obligation to go in and kind of redo that from scratch. Or if it's because this is the first Tull album, mainline Tull album that's being remixed by Bruce Sword, as opposed to Steve Wilson, who did the rest of the remixes. But at any rate, I think the differences are really apparent, especially if you're somebody who has listened to this album for a long time. The biggest kind of beneficial change to me is the increase of the low end and especially raising Dave Pegg's bass guitar. That change alone makes a gigantic difference in this album, and it's really welcome. I saw Bruce Sword talked a bit in the booklet about how a lot of albums that were released in the 80s, they all kind of lacked in the low end, and he kind of speculated that it may have been part of what audio systems were like back then. But I think that alone breathes a lot of life into this album and makes it feel much more refreshed and new. And that alone is the biggest beneficial impact here on the album. So on the topic of the drums, the first experience I had of listening to the new drums was the Lap of Luxury single that was put out about a month ago. And my initial reaction was that I wasn't very positive towards it. And the reason was because the sounds that they picked, they sound kind of like cheap MIDI off the shelf sounds to me. It seemed like their philosophy was they're not going to come in with a human drummer. Supposedly they had done a test. I saw a interview on YouTube with Bruce Sword, with a YouTuber who I'm not remembering their name, but he had said that they had done a test of one song with a human drummer for the remix and that it kind of didn't work out. That doesn't really surprise me, having actually played through this whole album. The way that the drum parts are written on this album, they're very unusual and kind of strange, and they're not how a human drummer would approach those parts. So just to have a human drummer playing them, I kind of understand if they didn't really get what they were going for. So instead, it seems like their philosophy was that they were just going to keep the same drum parts, but replace them with kind of more organic sounding drum parts. But especially in the cymbals, I feel like the MIDI that they chose, it just sounds a little stock to me. And so my initial reaction wasn't positive, but I wanted to withhold my judgment until I heard the whole thing. And what's really interesting, having heard the whole drum new mix now, is the tweaks that they made are so subtle on most of the tracks. I actually think that Lap of Luxury was the track that was kind of impacted the most by this new drum sound. But on most of the tracks, really, it's just they tweaked the snare and the kick drum, and that was kind of it. There are a couple parts where they tweaked the cymbals a bit. There's new crashes, there's new hats and parts, but there's even more places where they just left the original drum machine in. Like there's quite a lot of original hi-hat that's still in the new mix. But instead, they just kind of pared down that snare, mainly, and the kick drum to be a bit more flat and kind of acoustic sounding. And when I was listening to the new mixes, I really had to kind of remind myself that I was listening to a mix with new drums a lot of the time, because most of the time the new drums were just kind of falling in the background for me, and I wasn't even really, I kept forgetting that I was even hearing something that was new. And I guess maybe that was their intention, because so many people had complained about the drums on this album for so long. Maybe they just wanted it to kind of fall in the background that you don't even really notice it, but it doesn't have that, it doesn't stand out like the electric drums did. So I guess that's what they wanted, and I assume that's what a lot of kind of most Tull fans are going to want from this album, is they just don't want the drums to be an issue anymore. But for me, I just kind of forgot that they were even there. That's kind of how it felt to me when I was listening to the new drums. Um, on the original drum mix, the main thing they did, obviously the electric drums are the same, but they just kind of they remixed it and settled it a lot more so that it's not as jarring. I think a lot of the complaints about the drum machine, back in the day, I think they weren't really about the presence of the drum machine itself as much as that's how people like to talk about it. I think it was more so the way that the drums were mixed and how they sounded. Because of that lack of low end, the snare and especially was very loud. So when you listen to that original '80s mix, you hear this very like abrasive snare, loud snare on kind of every track, and I think that's what really annoyed a lot of people. So that is pretty much fixed now. They've kept the same drums in that mix, but they've just settled it a lot more to where you're not hearing that jarring snare all the time, and the low end kind of settles in and helps a lot with that to make it sound a lot more pleasing to the ear. That being said, I did notice that there are a couple elements that were missing in the new drums, both in the new drums and in the old drums, actually. Mostly there were crashes that were gone that I noticed used to be there and now were not anymore. So I think there were some changes that were made to the old drums. So if you ask me, is the new drum mix an improvement? I mean, for me personally, I don't hate it, but it just the fact that it's kind of this acoustic MIDI, it sounds a little too foreign for this album. With how electronic this album is, like I never had a problem with the fact that there was a drum machine there, and so it makes sense for me for there to be an electric drum sounds in these songs. So to take that away and to kind of put this kind of emulated acoustic sound in there, it's not bad, but it to me it just sounds a little bit too foreign for kind of the world space of this album. So for that reason, I think when I listen to Unwrapped going forward, I'm mainly going to be listening to the original drum mix, I think. Now, one thing that I'm quite iffy about on this remix is the way that the vocals were handled. So the lead vocals were made quite a bit louder, and they're also much clearer throughout the whole album. And I assume that's compression. I'm not an audiophile post-production guy, so maybe I'm wrong there. But they're actually so clear that I'm recognizing a lot of lyrics that I didn't really hear before in the album. I can very clearly hear certain words made out that I couldn't make out before. But as a result of the lead vocals being so much louder, it kind of feels like it centers a lot of these tracks more around the lead vocal. And vocals are very important on this album. There's a lot of interaction between the lead vocals and the backing vocals. There's a lot of kind of like call and response moments across a lot of the songs between the lead and backing vocals. The problem, though, is that it feels like they didn't adjust the volume of the backing vocals to match the sound of the louder lead vocals. So what that kind of leads to is that a lot of these backing vocals feel so quiet, and a lot of that interaction is kind of lost, honestly. A lot of these backing vocals are just kind of buried in the back, and I really kind of strain to hear them a lot of the time. So some songs that you can hear this especially on are on Under Wraps #1 and Later That Same Evening. Those are both songs that really have that kind of, you know, they critically focus on those call and response interactions, and they're a lot harder to find now. I even found kind of a lack of consistency in a lot of the tracks in terms of the volume between the vocals throughout the track. So one example of that is on the bridge of Apogee when he's talking about the unearthly daffodils. There's a bunch of different overlapping vocal tracks there, and some of them are like wildly different in terms of volume from each other, and it's very kind of confusing to listen to. So that's been really kind of disappointing for me on this, is that I'm just really straining to hear these kind of classic, iconic vocal parts that I'm just not really hearing to the same effect anymore. One additional mistake in this that I'm quite disappointed with is in the on the original drum mix of Nobody's Car. There is a problem with the drums where the drum track is slightly out of sync with the rest of the track. So the easiest place you can hear this is if you listen to the beginning. The wood block is on beat, but the hi-hat is out of rhythm with the wood block, and the whole rest of the drum part is out of sync for the entire track. It's slight, but it is there. So I, that's a pretty egregious error to make in something like this. I'm kind of amazed that that didn't pass, quality control or whatever. And it's particularly frustrating because this would actually be the second major mistake that's found in a Tull remix. So outside of the after the timing mistake that was made in the drum solo on the second side of Thick as a Brick. So, I've been trying to kind of raise some noise about this where I can online, just in the hopes that maybe the Tull camp can hear about this and address it before they turn their attention to something else. Nothing can be done about the CDs, obviously, that have been sent out, but I'm hoping maybe we can get a patch to streaming services to fix this, I hope. But it's very disappointing to see that error otherwise. when I first heard Nobody's Car on this remix, it struck me how it sounded so lethargic and kind of slow to me, and I didn't understand what was going on at first. I was wondering, did they slow it down? What's going on? And it was only after I kind of listened to it further and saw some comments online that I saw that it was in fact out of sync. So it's disappointing. But I mean, overall, I'm being a little harsh on critical on things, but this is a very good sonic wash of this album, which was desperately in need of a remix. I mean, this was desperately in need of one more than basically any album in the Tull discography, I think. Some of the songs that I thought came out really well were songs like European Legacy, Radio Free Moscow, Apogee, and later that same evening, aside from the backing vocals. So there's a lot to be happy about on this, especially if you're someone who is a longtime fan of this album. One last additional thing I wanted to talk about musically on this album, the song that was kind of impacted the most by this remix was Saboteur. There's a ton of new synth lines that are in this that were never there before. So I don't know if this was something that was recorded for the album at the time that was cut and they put it back on. I was hoping they would mention it in the booklet, but they actually didn't talk about it at all. But that was the one thing that really stood out to me, is like, wow, that's new. Of all the synth lines on Saboteur, you can especially hear it on the bridge of Saboteur. There's an entirely new synth melody that wasn't there before. But I mean, I think overall, I'm I'm happy that we even got this. I mean, I'm amazed that we actually got this remix, and I'm very happy to be seeing this album be having its moment in the sun after all these years of being maligned and talked trash upon. I think that everything I've been seeing about this online from fans has been positive, so that's great. And it's just, as a longtime fan, I'm really happy to see this album kind of done justice and having its moment. So thanks for listening to this. What do you think about Under Wraps? What do you think about this remix? I'm really interested to hear what other people think. If you liked this kind of style of vlog video of me talking to the camera, let me know. I may do more of them. But in the meantime, thanks for listening and have a good one.